Today we're talking about talking in books.
Dialogue.
Dialogue that sounds realistic and helps with characterization.
This is another video in our novel writing tips series, an author's journey from conception to publication. Hi, I'm Tahlia Newland, the managing editor of AIA Publishing.
And I'm Rose Newland, the book designer and publishing assistant. So, dialogue. I know an author should avoid having too many saids, but how do you avoid having too many saids? Do you use things like he espoused or she ruminated instead?
No. I mean, yes, you should avoid having he said, she said, they said, George said. Definitely don't overdo the saids. But the way to not overdo the saids is not to replace said with fancy dialogue tags like espoused. A lot of beginning writers get confused with this, especially because in our schooling as a primary school kid, you may have been asked to come up with a whole lot of different words than said. And so some authors think that, yes, they should use what we call fancy dialogue tags.
It gets too much if you use those all the time.
Yeah, simple dialogue tags are basically said and replied, like, with the occasional shouted or yelled or something like that. The reason why you don't use the fancy tags is because they jump out at you. Right?
They become really obvious.
So if you say said, it's such a plain word that the reader just reads over it. It's just like, okay, all it's doing
does the job.
Yeah, it's a tag. It's tagging who spoke, and that's fine, you know. So no problem with that. The only problem is if you overuse it. But if you replace it with the fancy tags, then it's like in
really
your
obvious.
It's just like in your face, and you get the sense that the author's trying really hard to use something other than said. And it becomes very kind of inauthentic.
Yeah, but you also shouldn't overuse said.
Exactly.
So what do you do instead?
You don't use a tag at all.
Oh.
Now that doesn't mean that you leave the reader hanging so they don't know who's speaking. Yeah,
Wait, I lost track of this conversation.
Yeah, no, you don't do that. Instead, you could have like a paragraph where, say George is speaking. Say he says, oh, Beryl, I'm off to the supermarket. I'm going to get some pears and potatoes. Do you want anything? Said George. Or you can say, George walked into the room. Oh, Beryl, I'm going to the supermarket. Do you want me to pick up anything for you? So you've already shown who's speaking by the action.
Mentioning George.
Yeah, it's by having George do something. Beryl looks up from her knitting. Oh, no, thanks, George. I've got everything I need at the moment. And the reader knows that that's Beryl saying that. There's no need to say he said, she said.
So you sort of do it with a description of what the character does instead of saying they said.
Yeah, what they do.
And then you get to show them doing something at the same time. So that's very efficient.
Exactly, and it makes the dialogue more interesting. And of course you can, if you've just got two people talking, you don't need a tag at all. Like, you need to tag occasionally so people don't forget
lose track of who's who.
But if it's just two people, and especially if the voices are different enough, then you can just allow the punctuation to show that it's the other person speaking. I need to tell you a story about said and fancy tags. Okay, I was doing a workshop with a publisher, a mainstream publisher, years ago, and she said, when it comes to dialogue, she said, it's one of the markers that I use to reject manuscripts quickly. She said, I will open up a manuscript and I'll have a look and I'll go down. And if they use anything other than said as a dialogue tag, I reject it.
Wow.
Just like that.
Harsh.
And the whole sort of group kind of went, oh. And she said, and she said, because it's just unskilled. She said, if an author doesn't understand how to, not use said without using all these fancy words, then they haven't got the skill to write a book that we're interested in. And it was just like, wow, that's really brutal. But that was how important she thought it was. And I mean, obviously if they said he said, she said all the time, she'd probably reject it as well, you know. So you need a variety of stuff, so sometimes he said, she said, but a lot of the time you just use the action as the indicator of who is speaking.
Right. You mentioned leaving it up to the punctuation. Is that like where every new person talking has to start on a new line? Is that the rule?
Yeah, that kind of thing. And you have a paragraph, so say if George is doing something and speaking, that's one paragraph. So you don't have George doing something and then George speaking it, and there's in two different paragraphs. You have that
It gets confusing.
You have that in one, yeah. You have to have that in one paragraph. So if George is scratching his hair and then he says something, that's all one paragraph. And then it's another paragraph for the other person's action and the other person's speech.
Yeah.
And sometimes people get it wrong and they have someone talking and it's connected to the other person's action. It's really wrong.
Punctuation, the formatting of dialogue
is quite important.
Quite important.
Yeah. And so you can have the action first and the dialogue at the end is that paragraph of action, and that's fine.
Yeah.
That's much better than having a paragraph of action and then on the next paragraph you put what that person said. That gets confusing because you think it's a different person.
Yeah, so you can rely on the punctuation, for a quick exchange, but how long would you leave it without like putting a tag or grounding it in someone's action? Like,
Yeah.
I feel like there's got to be a limit on like, if I'm reading, there's a few lines without anyone, you kind of go, oh, well, that's the other person, that's the other person, but then you need, is there sort of a limit to how long?
I mean, I have seen very long exchanges and they do work in certain books where you want a really fast pace.
Yes,
but
no, yes, no.
Yeah, that's right. And if it's very short sort of dialogue. But yes, 4 lines, maybe 4 max, because then the person starts to get
who it is.
Yeah, starts to get confused. The other thing with that is it can easily become what we call ungrounded. If your dialogue's just dialogue, and even if you've got seds, even if you've got tags on it, if it's not related to a scene, the reader forgets where it's happening.
If it's a really long conversation.
Yeah, if it's really, and it's like, and then I know I've had this when I've read, and you just
floating in a void.
Exactly. You just get the sense that these 2 people or 3 people, or whatever, are just floating in a white out, and I've completely forgotten where they are. So you have to ground the dialogue. It's
Someone take a sip of wine.
Exactly. It's called grounding. And, they look out the window. And it also adds to characterization. So
that's a good way of like showing.
Yeah.
Like the way that they fidget when they're talking.
Exactly. And the way their gestures, their facial expressions, their tone of voice, you add those in so that the dialogue doesn't just sort of float by itself.
Yeah. I guess the other thing which goes back to characterization is like how characters talk. Because even within one writer's voice, you need to have some differentiation in how the characters talk.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah. You've got to be really careful that your characters don't all sound the same. Because as an author, you know what you want them to say. Yeah. So
they're all going to talk like you if you're not careful.
Yeah. So if you know what you want them to say and you write what you want them to say, that's a very different approach to having the character
put it in their words.
Say it. Yeah. So the character may not say exactly what you want them to say. In actual fact. If you really get inside the character and you are the character when you're writing, you're much more likely to speak the way that character speaks and therefore write the way that character writes.
But characters don't always say what they actually mean either, like real humans.
Exactly. That comes down to this sort of thing where sometimes you have characters who will tell someone that they've just met their whole backstory. Yeah. And it's like, it's obvious that the author wants to tell you about this character, so they have the character telling it to someone else, but it's really just an info dump. Yeah. In dialogue.
It's an excuse for exposition.
Yeah, and it's just put in dialogue, but it's still an info dump. And that's not how people are when they meet somebody new.
Yeah, it's got to be true to the character.
And true to
sound realistic.
Yeah, and true to how people are in conversation. And people invariably do not bare their souls easily.
Yes.
And certainly not to people that they've...
Not without particularly probing questions from
Yes.
the other person.
It's this difference between writing what you want the character to say and writing what the character says.
Yeah.
And for instance, if you've got different generations, they should use different words and they should have different speech patterns.
Yeah.
So, for instance, if you've got an elderly lady, she might speak more formally and she's not going to use words like awesome and cool and,
Yeah.
you know, all of that kind of stuff. So you have to...
Oh, poppycock! Say things like that instead.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And if it's a historical fiction, for instance, then...
You got to do a bit of research.
That's right. And you can't use words that haven't come into effect. So, for instance, the word cool, used in the meaning of intensely good, started to come in about the 1930s.
Really?
Yeah, but it wasn't really picked up until about the 1960s, and then it started to be more of a thing. So you couldn't write on someone in the early 1900s using the word cool.
Or the 1800s even.
Yeah.
Who they are affects how they talk.
And when you're writing fantasy or science fiction and you've got different races, and the high elves, for instance, might not use contractions and they might use formal names. So they might say something like, "Oh, Sir George, I cannot abide this situation." Whereas the protagonist, who maybe is a modern person who's slipped through a portal, or, you know, just the country witch who's more personable and more informal sort of thing, she would say something like, "Oh, George, I just can't hack this," you know. So...
Yeah, different like slang words, characters with accents.
And
you're like,
there's a little point
so
too.
many apostrophes, I don't know what I'm reading.
And that's a point too.
You cannot help him, love.
You have to be careful. I mean, I know Huckleberry Finn and stuff was...
That's what I was thinking of.
I couldn't read that. I've never actually finished it. I couldn't. It's just like it's too difficult to read. Even though there's a very famous book that has all of this dialect written like that, it's not advisable to do that because it does make it hard for people to read, and there will be some readers who will just put it aside.
Got to get your beta readers in on that one. And
it's like how much is
this
too
person
much
talking?
Yeah, and you can just put it like at the beginning, and then just a few peppers in later on in the dialogue to remind people that they have this accent. You don't have to write the whole thing in that accent.
Yeah. What else is important apart from all those things we just said?
Well, if you want your dialogue to be really sophisticated, use subtext.
That goes back to like where a character says one thing but actually means another thing.
Yeah.
I'm fine, but then sits really uncomfortably.
And looks very unfine.
Unpleasant.
And it also goes back to the grounding, where you are telling how people look, what they do, their expressions, their tone of voice, that kind of thing. So the subtext can tell you a whole lot about what's really happening to the people, and gives a whole nother layer. So you can have a conversation on this level, and then underneath that you've got this other thing going on, body language. And that kind of thing. And that is very
clever.
And that is also very, very realistic. I mean, people don't express themselves well often. They want to say something, but they get it all mixed up. And as a writer, you want to be clear about what they're saying, but at the same time, you don't want to be so clear that it sounds like this person
is just espousing their soul.
At the same time, don't sort of add, well. It's like, how people say, well, I think this, and oh, well, da-da-da-da. In actual fact, leave the well out. So even though that is a natural way to speak, in writing, you just, the well. The occasional well is fine. The occasional sort of that kind of thing, you just best to leave them out.
Yeah.
Hello. Come on, sweetie.
Loki doesn't know anything about writing dialogue.
It's going to you.
Oh, hey.
So vary how you tag the dialogue. So sometimes you use a tag, he said, she said. Sometimes you use action, sometimes no tag at all. And if you've got an exclamation mark, you don't have to say he exclaimed.
True.
Right? Because the exclamation mark shows.
That's what the punctuation's there for.
Exactly. So either the exclamation mark or the he exclaimed. The thing is that, again, using that kind of stuff shows lazy writing because you're using your dialogue tags to say something about the situation, whereas if you've written the situation really well, you just won't need it. Yeah, because it'll be obvious from what they say. You don't want, get in here, George, he demanded.
Yeah.
So here's a little tip that a lot of people don't know about, and that is put the name of the speaker before the tag. And the reason you say George said instead of said George is for immediacy. Like you're reading along, you want to know who's speaking, get their name first. Not said George. George said. Right? It's much more immediate writing. If you've got a long bit of dialogue that one person's speaking, don't wait to the very end of that to
signify who it is.
To signify who it is. So
that
if
makes
you've
sense.
got the reader's got to read all the way to the end before they find out who's speaking. Whereas if you say,
what do I imagine at that point?
And by the time you've found out who's speaking, it's sort of like as you read, you haven't had that in your imagination. And
that's a tip.
It's a good tip, yeah.
So that seems like a lot of things to keep in mind when writing dialogue. It seems a lot more difficult than I thought it would be. How do you recommend people
approach writing dialogue?
I mean, for me, that's like, well, that's a lot of things to
It sounds like a lot of things.
About.
Yeah. I think you can simplify it right down with two things. Okay. One is be the character when you write. So be in the scene. Actually be the character and say what the character would say, not what you want them to say. So be the character when you're writing. The other thing is read it out loud. This is really, really important because if you've written a modern person saying, I just cannot run to the supermarket. A modern person says, I can't bear this. I don't know what to do. They use contractions.
Yeah.
And if you had read it out loud, you would have picked that up.
It's a really good test for it.
And if you're looking for it, like, do they sound different? Then you will hear it. So those are the two tips.
So there you go. There's a bunch of tips on how to skillfully write dialogue.
So that's it from us for today. Thanks for watching.
And a reminder, this was part of our series, Novel Writing Tips, an author's journey from conception to publication. There's been a few before this and there will be more to come. So if you enjoyed this content, please give it a like, a share, and maybe subscribe to our channel if you want to see what else we are publishing. Bye!